Good day, everyone. Today I'm with a very special person, Dr. Robert M. Price. Dr. Price, can you introduce yourself to us, please?
Well, I guess my infamy or notoriety probably centers around the Bible Geek podcast I do, and I'm a PhD in systematic theology with another PhD in New Testament, both from Drew University. I've written a mess of books. Probably you could take that both ways. Things like Beyond Born Again, Deconstructing Jesus, the widow traditions in Luke Acts. Not all of them are polemical. I do study the Bible for its own sake, not just to make it a volleyball between competing religious or anti-religious teams. I am not a believer in God, but I am also not a believer in atheism. I find both. Well, I figure I've got to sort of take a position outside the game. I'm just interested in these particular issues. I find it distasteful to seek to separate people from their profound religious beliefs. That's none of my business. I teach religions of the world and love all the religions of the world, and which makes me kind of a bad atheist, but that's okay with me. And I guess my latest big thing in writing is the completion of the third volume of my Bible introduction, Holy Fable, the Bible Undistorted by Faith. And I'm working on more books all the time. I'm also, I guess, not germane to this, kind of big fish in the small fish bowl of H.P. Lovecraft and his horror fantasies and so on. And I got my hands in various pies, usually pizza pies, and I'm always interested to dialogue and talk and have fun on these issues.
Likewise, and thank you very much for that introduction. I believe today we will be discussing the historicity of the New Testament. And there's the big M word, the word myth. That's a big bad word these days. Could you do me the favor and explain to me what exactly myth is in the context of the New Testament?
Well, there are various types of myths, most of them found in the Bible. A great number of them are legitimation or legitimization myths, and trying to account for and justify the practices of the religious community that created them. Nobody really seems to understand their myths as myths. That's part of the process. It's like in every society, there are people who frame the rules and espouse beliefs that rationalize the rules, providing what Peter Berger calls a sacred canopy of values, all sanctioned by God or the gods or the ancestors or whatever. And though regular human beings like ourselves originally came up with them, but as they pass down from one generation to the next, they come to have their own autonomy. And since all of these beliefs and values far predated the current generation of believers, they take on the halo of a divine origin, and indeed they are superhuman in a way because of their authority stemming from the past and from venerated founders and all of that. And so the myths tend to legitimate things like that, like when Jesus is challenged about divorce and he says, well, here's the way God intended it, and he refers to the creation stories in Genesis. It seems to me highly unlikely that those stories, the seven-day creation and the Garden of Eden, are factual or historical, though it was easier to think they were before science. But the idea was to say what is a fundamental importance. The law that cannot be broken is the way the gods created it. And so myths are important to safeguard authority. But as Bultmann said, myths appear to be also ways of depicting the self-understanding of a nation or a religious community, like the myths of Prometheus and of Icarus in Greek mythology. These embody the understanding of the ancient Greeks as intellectuals, that they strive for a truth that is probably unavailable ultimately, but it's a North Star that you have to follow, and it's worth the sacrifice, even though it may bring you crashing down to the earth like Icarus, or stapled to a boulder like Prometheus. But I mean, that's the kind of thing I don't think you would find in many cultures where the main issue is simply survival. In the Bible, you have a sort of a similar view that human beings are just lower than God, but just higher than animals. And there's the fallenness aspect that some cultures don't really have. Like Joseph Campbell used to say that what struck him about visiting Japan was here was a culture that had no notion that the world was fallen in any way. Yeah, that's going to be reflected in people's sense of guilt or futility or their lack of it. So myths often, or the stories of Jesus exorcising demons and things like that, they seem to be summations of the early Christian experience of being liberated from what had compelled and enslaved them psychologically, or they hoped politically. And so they see, Paul Tillich used to say that people are inclined to complain that so-and-so is only a symbol. It's not literally true. And he says, no, you're misunderstanding. What you should say is something like the Garden of Eden or whatever is no less than a symbol. Because if you, excuse me, if you just had a factual story of marvels and amazing things like the Red Sea parting or a guy rising from the dead, how would this really be any different than the abominable snowman or flying saucers? It would be pretty interesting, but what would be the meaning? What would be the relevance of that? Well, of course, it's because these stories are really I like to say, like the computer icons you click on of rituals, which are transformative. Nobody would care if Jesus supposedly rose from the dead if it weren't actualized in the ritual of baptism. And similarly, and so then you have to ask, well, suppose that it didn't actually happen, but the symbolic rituals do have their power, not because of a historical basis, but because of an existential transformation they occasion. And so I think with, though I wouldn't say I really identify with any one faith anymore, it's clear to me that faith is transformative, and that it's the symbolic character of the stories that make that possible, and the history or lack of it really is irrelevant. It's certainly irrecoverable. We can pretend we know what happened, but we don't. I mean, even some Christian apologists will admit that. My late great friend
One
Clark
second,
Pinnock used to say
Dr.
that.
Tice. I just wanted to unpack a little bit about what you said just now. So
Hmm.
I think you covered social formation technically and myth making at the same time. And one of the things that you referenced was the words that Jesus used in the New Testament. You don't believe he actually used those words. You think it's ipssisima, vox in this case, if I'm not mistaken, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. Jesus as a character said this and that. Whether there was a Jesus who actually said it on some occasion, there's reason to doubt that. It could be so, but I don't think it can ever be settled. I'd be surprised if somebody was able to settle it.
Well, there is something you mentioned earlier, which is that people tend to form these myths and traditions to give them some kind of pre-eternal reason for existence. So, for example, there's this History of the Church by Van Pelikan. It's a Christian author. And in his History of the Church, he actually mentions that most Christians give themselves a history, i.e., myth making, because they want their truth to appear as if it came pre-eternally and didn't begin to start existing at some point in history. So we find that in Christian writings and in your writings as well. So technically, what you're saying is literally confirmed by Christian authors who write on church tradition. Now, I just wanted to mention, when you speak of people putting words on Jesus' lips, the ipssisima vox, do you think, for example, when they use the cynical traditions, primarily from Diogenes, that people at that time would recognize those statements? Or do you think it was more like people were familiar with those sayings, like, why do you sit with the sinners, or why do you call me good? Were those popular sayings at that time attributed only to Jesus, or was it something common, like night, just do it? People were familiar with the statement in one way and had some familiarity with it, so they were more likely to agree with it, and it wouldn't matter if Jesus actually said it or not. Is that the case with most of the New Testament sayings?
I think that is true because there is virtually no statement about behavior, ethics, morality, etc., ascribed to Jesus in the Gospels that you cannot find sometimes verbatim in the sayings of rabbis from the general period around the time, the ostensible time of Jesus, or in Cynic and Stoic philosophy. And this was a very cosmopolitan era in the Mediterranean world and beyond. And so would everybody have known that, oh, hey, the Cynics said that, Diogenes said that? I doubt that, but they probably would have heard it, just like today. And even within one stream of tradition, Jacob Neusner has shown how you have the same statement in the Mishnah ascribed to various rabbis, as if nobody really knew who said it, but they figured, well, it must have been Rabbi so and so. And I think the same would be true here. Did Jesus say this, or did Pythagoras say it? There's modern examples of this that you hear over and over again, like when people say, the Bible says God helps those who help themselves. No, that's not in the Bible. I know it's in an ancient Hercules myth, but it's not in the Bible. Or another one, I was listening to a show that sort of inspired the Bible Geek years ago, a thing called, I think, Bible Questionnaire. Somebody called in and said, where in the Bible does it say neither borrower nor lender be? And the host, who was a very learned man, nonetheless was hunting around in his Bible and looking at his concordance. Where the heck is that thing? I tried to get through to say, look, that's not in the Bible. It's from Hamlet. That's what Polonius tells them, and so on, couldn't get through. The lines were jammed. But people, I've heard other instances of that. Or how about a penny saved is a penny earned, as the Bible says? No, it doesn't. And they just figure it sounds good. It must be Jesus or whoever. And that's, nobody's deceiving anybody. There's no scheming. It's no hoax, no deception. It's just, you figure it sounds good. It's true. Well, I know who speaks the truth. It must be Jesus. And so it's all completely innocent, but it sure makes it difficult to tell not only what Jesus, but what Rabbi Akiba must originally have said. It's just way too late. Or Buddhism, holy mackerel, that nobody wrote anything down for something like 400 years after the Buddha supposedly lived, and it's highly unlikely that anybody remembered specifically. Or the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad. It was al-Bukhari and others realized, wait a minute, we've got tens of thousands of these hadith. They cannot possibly all go back to the prophet. And so he and others tried to weed them out, but we're still left with a huge pile of them that modern scholars still debate. It's just the way it happened in a world before printing presses and tape recorders. And does it really matter? Like if you're reading the Sermon on the Mount, and it touches your conscience, yeah, maybe forgiving and turning the other cheek would be a better way. Does it really matter who said it? I mean, if it sounded utter nonsense, would you obey it just because Jesus said it? Stand on your hands every Thursday afternoon? Well, if Jesus said it, I guess I better. No, you'd explain it away some way, like people do. Give up all your possessions. Nobody's going to do that. And so they say, well, he didn't really mean it. So it really doesn't matter. It's, does deep speak unto deep? Do these things strike your reason and your conscience and your better judgment as something you want to do? Seems to me that's the authority of them.
Well, Dr. Price, there is the problem where in the author of the Gospel of Matthew, when he's copying from Mark, how does he show respect to Jesus' words? Doesn't he delete the Aramaic sayings of Jesus? I think in only 2 instances, he actually gives you the English translation. And in other instances, he deletes the words completely. He doesn't bother to translate when he raises the girl or in other instances. So how much did they really care if the author of the Gospel of Matthew was willing to delete the Aramaic sayings of Jesus? He didn't even bother to translate them. So this, I believe you know about the Aramaisms of Mark and Matthew. So what do you think about that?
Well, Luke also does not care for Aramaic, and like he doesn't have the crowd say Hosanna. What does that mean? My Hellenistic readers aren't going to understand that. Or the 2 stories where Jesus is quoted by Mark in Aramaic, Ephatha, be opened, and the deaf guy hears, or Talitha Kumi, little girl, rise up. That Matthew and Luke not only leave out the Aramaic, they leave out the stories. And the reason for both is the same, in that both stories depict Jesus as a magician, not a stage magician, but what we might call a faith healer. And he has to use techniques. He spits on the tongue of the deaf man because it's like he's tongue-tied, and Jesus has to, or anybody else doing this, had to lubricate it to loosen it. Or the deaf guy, well, there must be some obstruction, so he puts his fingers in his ears, pulls them out, and says Ephatha, sympathetic magic, or I guess that's imitative magic. It's like the later gospel writers didn't want to depict Jesus as a magician, though for some centuries some Christians didn't mind that. We have an old glass bowl from Egyptian Christians showing Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead using a magic wand. Well, they didn't mind, but some people did. And so Matthew and Luke say, look what he's doing, look what he's saying. We don't really need that. Jesus did this stuff simply because he was the Son of God. So there are theological reasons because the beliefs were already evolving. And again, it's not like deception, they're just amending it.
Well, one thing I did want to point out was that I believe Papias, I don't know if you pronounce it Papias or Papias, doesn't really matter, yeah?
I don't know either.
No one knows, right? But when it comes to the early myth-making in Christianity, specifically the Gospel of Mark, I believe, what's his name? Burton Mark points this out as well, is that there were miracle sets, 2 sets of miracle sets in the Gospel of Mark. So there's a healing miracle, a water miracle, and I believe a food miracle, and there's 2 sets of those 3 miracles. And what?
Oh, more than that, there's a couple of other ones, healing and exorcism and so on, yeah.
But specifically, these are the things that Elisha and Elijah did. And so we can see that the author of Mark is drawing from a previous tradition. This is not necessarily the things that the Christ actually did historically. So I think that the audiences of Matthew, Mark, and Luke had to be distinctive absolutely distinct audiences, and they draw on the sources not out of some sense of servitude, but of serving some polemical purpose. I do not see the Gospels as a historical bias. I see them necessarily as works of propaganda to achieve a good cause. In that good cause, I mean inviting people to do good, to treat the poor well and the sick well. That is what I see the gospel literature trying to motivate people to do. I believe there's this book by Barry Wilson. I forgot the exact title. It's a Canadian author. But he actually tells you, if you look at the gospels themselves, if you ignore Paul's writings, most of what Jesus says is about being the teacher of righteousness, do good, help the poor. It's very little about revolutions or politics or violence. His is more a moral message, basically. Everything else with the miracles added on just seems to be later additions to serve some polemical purpose. So I wanted to bring your attention to the Gospel of John. This is my favorite gospel. I don't know if you like it as much as I do. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read one verse for you, and I just want you to give me your thoughts on this, okay?
Mm.
So typically, when you appeal to a witness, you're appealing to someone to support your case, yeah?
Mm.
So in John chapter 19, verse 35, it's probably my most favorite line in the Bible. It says, "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe." How helpful is that? There's some random guy that we don't know about testifying to something we have no idea about, and they're appealing to this person as an authority, as a witness, but he is anonymous. How is that supposed to help us believe as they believe? What
You
would
know,
you
that's in the so-called Johannine Appendix, chapter 21, which is surely a later addition to the Gospel, since at the end of chapter 20 it says, well, I could go on and on, but there's no room to record all of that, but I have written this much so you'll believe that Jesus is the Son of God and have eternal life. Well, then suddenly it cranks up again, and we have the resurrection appearance by the lake and Peter and Jesus dialogue, and then at the end it sort of paraphrases the original ending with the addition of what you just quoted. And
One
it
second,
is,
Dr. Price. So we are in chapter 19 right now, just to be clear, chapter 19, right?
that's the one with the blood and water
Yeah, yeah.
from the yeah, that I think is an interpolation by the author of chapter 21. It's all of a piece, and the irony is, who is this? There's no name given, and it
Nothing.
says you'll have to take my word for it. It's just like in chapter 20 where Jesus appears to the disciples, and Thomas is afterwards said not to have been there. He was out picking up the pizza or something, and he gets back and says, "What? Jesus raised from the dead? Come on, you're putting me on. I'll have to put my finger in the nail wounds and my hand in his side before I'm going to believe it." And so Jesus taps him on the shoulder and says, "Well, here's your chance." And he says, basically, you can picture Jesus turning to the audience and saying, have you believed because you've seen? Well, blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believe. Come on. Like, this is supposed to convince you? You're still dependent on some unknown narrator telling you this. It's just, it just is so self-defeating. But that, in a way, sums up the whole thing. How are you to prove this? And if you need to prove it, to take it seriously, you're up the creek. I think you're right that always, and even today, people look at the gospel or all the Bible stories as edifying catechism or whatever you want to call it. They have been told that it's historically true, so they believe that. But if they had not been told that, I don't think they'd care, because that's not really why they value this material anyway. It's like, what can I learn from it? How can I apply it? Oh, you mean this guy also existed? What difference? This is a bizarre analogy, but the other day I was out to lunch and heard a couple of women talking about, at another table, talking about American Horror Story.
Okay, I know that show. I don't like it, but I know it.
This one, the hotel, that season, it has to do with this hotel that this crazy man built with all kinds of secret chambers
So
and
they
all
go
that, and
here to kill people.
mass murderer. And I wasn't going to make a jerk of myself and go interrupt him, but I thought, that guy actually existed. We know who he was. He really did this. And would that matter to these women who had liked the show or whatever? It doesn't really matter. The story is a universe unto itself. Well, kind of interesting that, or I saw a commercial about King Midas and turning stuff to gold. There apparently was a King Midas. Don't think he turned things to gold, but he was a king of ancient Lydia. So what? It's interesting, but does it really add to or take away from the myth that we know? And I just don't see how.
Well, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think at the end of John chapter 20, the author, the initial author, I believe in this case, literally says, I write these things so you may believe. So he's not writing these things for historical posterity. He's writing these things to convince you of a position. And technically, when you package media to convince someone of that a specific conclusion, the technical term for that is propaganda. But I just want to go back really quickly. Think about this person sitting down and writing. I think it's a good idea to let them know some anonymous person thinks that this is true. Somehow this will help my case. There's another verse I want to bring to your attention. Same chapter, John chapter 19, verse 38, right? And it says, later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. Now, here's my problem with these verses. One, Arimathea doesn't exist, at least by that name. Two, they're appealing to someone who's a secret follower. It's as good as appealing to a wall. It doesn't help you testify to anything, right?
Yeah.
And thirdly, here's the thing. This could not have been written at the time that if Joseph did exist at his time, because Joseph would have been fearing for his life. You specifically give where he is from and who he is and what his relationship to Pilate is. That is something to be killed over, right? So if the church under James was being persecuted in Jerusalem, I don't believe that this could have been written at all at that time. It could have only been written by a person who never knew Joseph or knew that Joseph was dead. But here is the problem I bring to you, Dr. Price, which is, again, the author, I don't know if this is a later author or the initial author, but why would they appeal to a person who is a secret witness in a town that nobody knows the name of? Who is that going to convince?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. How about at the in the crucifixion account in Mark, where they grab Simon of Cyrene out of the crowd? Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. What does that matter? I mean, that might presuppose that he expected readers to know who they were, but that's just a wild guess. And the secrecy thing you mentioned, you really start having to get suspicious when you hear that. Well, Jesus said he spoke in parables to the crowd, but to a select few he explained them. Wait a minute, are we sure that's what Jesus meant? I mean, this is a way of saying nobody seems to remember Jesus given this interpretation, but luckily we have the inside track. Or how about the appearance of the young man at the empty tomb in Mark? He tells the women, go tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. And they're so terrified, he explicitly says they fled away in great fear and said nothing to anybody. How does Mark know this in that case? And not only that, the other gospels who follow Mark pretty much up to that point don't just add to it, they contradict and rewrite Mark's ending so that it will end another way. That alone ought to rule out any thought that what follows is historical. All the secret stuff, Gnostics use this all the time, that, Jesus came back after his ascension for, 11 years even, and he taught all this stuff. Now, I know you've never heard it. It's been a secret up till now. Come on. I mean, it's possible, but what are the chances? It just seems obvious. It's again, you're trying to seek Jesus' authority for what you've come up with, and people did that all the time. That's why they wrote under the names of Enoch and Baruch. If I say this, who's going to care? But if Enoch, who ascended to heaven, said it, okay, they're going to believe it. It's pious fraud, and it's everywhere in the ancient world.
Well, Dr. Price, I think we should wrap up there. But now that we've reached the end, I think we've had a fantastic conversation. You've raised some brilliant points. Could you do me the favor and let us know about your Patreon and your latest book that's going to be upcoming soon?
Well, there is the 3 volumes of Holy Fable that are on Amazon. The first one's Holy Fable, the Old Testament undistorted by faith. Then the second one is Holy Fable, the Gospels and Acts undistorted by faith. And then thirdly, Holy Fable, the Epistles and the Apocalypse undistorted by faith. I guarantee that even Bible fans reading this will learn about theories and possibilities they simply would never have heard, not because I'm so brilliant. Much of it is not original to me, but I've drawn on sources that nobody mentions anymore. Then another one is Bart Ehrman Interpreted, subtitled How One Radical New Testament Scholar Understands Another. And there are other things coming out, but I guess those would be the big ones, and those are all readily available on Amazon. And what I'm about to work on, I'm looking right now to huge stacks of books I need to use for research. I'm going to do one called Christ, Mythicism, and Gospel Christology, which deals with the question, if there wasn't a Jesus, and Jesus was originally supposed to be a celestial being and only later reinterpreted as a human being, why do the Gospels seem to go in the opposite direction, with a more human Jesus in Mark, a more divine one in the later John? So I'm going into that. Then the other one is Judaizing Jesus, where I look at a whole lot of stuff written today saying that Jesus was a kind of a rabbinic Jew. He wasn't the Lutheran that the old German theologians used to say. And I want to suggest that I think that is not really historical work, but it's ecumenical theology. They're trying to say, look, we Christians feel guilty about the rotten way we've always treated Jews, so we're going to kind of give away the store and say that Jesus was really on your side, not ours. And I want to say any Jesus you came up with would be a kind of fiction, and here's why I think this one is.
What about your Patreon, Dr. Price?
I guess you just look up Patreon Robert M. Price, and every month I put up 1 or 2 essays, and I do a Human Bible podcast, which I used to do for the Center for Inquiry, and it's much like the Bible Geek, but a lot of people seem to like it better. I don't know why. I also have a monthly column that you can subscribe to for free from my website, and that is robertmprice.mindvendor.com, and the column is called Zarathustra Speaks. And that's totally free, and well, that's I guess that's mainly it. I sure appreciate people's interest and support.
Well, Dr. Price, thank you very much for your time and your energy. And I look forward to having discussions on these topics again with you soon. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks so much.
You too.